Then, now let's take a look at characteristics of Huawei VM disks. The VM disks in Huawei, we can characterize them by sharing type. We have shared disks and non-shared disks. So a shared disk, it means the disk can be used by multiple VMs. It can be used by 2 or more VMs. A non-shared disk, it means it can only be used by 1 VM. Right. Then we have the configuration mode. We have common disks. We have thin provisioning disks and thick provisioning zeroed disks. Right. A common disk, this is where the system allocates disk space based on disk capacity. Okay. Based on disk capacity, what's the capacity of the disk, and then it allocates space based on the disk capacity. In thin provisioning and thick provisioning, these now are related to the concepts that we have just looked at. If we say thin provisioning, it means we are starting by, the system allocates part of the configured disk capacity on creation and allocates the rest of the disk space dynamically until configured space is allocated. So it means in thin provisioning, if the disk space has been initially allocated, say maybe 50 gigabytes. So if the VM has been allocated 50 gigabytes in thin provisioning, it doesn't give it the whole 50 gigabytes at start. So the 50 gigabytes in this case becomes the allocated disk space. But it will get some memory which is less than this at the beginning. Let's say maybe 2 gig, for instance. It starts by being given 2 gig. Now it will get the other 498 gig to get to 500, depending on its actual needs. If it needs more memory, it gets an extra memory. Let's suppose maybe after using this 2 gig, next time the data requirements would need, say, maybe 5 gig. It will get the next 5 gig. It won't get the whole remaining space. It will get 5 gig, which means 2 plus 5, that will be 7 gig. Again, it will still be having 43 gig remaining from the 5th. Right. If it just uses 7 gig and it's fine, it will remain using the 7 gig. If it needs more memory, it will be allocated more memory, okay, until the whole 50 gig is exhausted. Now, if you are using the thin provisioning disk mode, this allows for memory overcommitment. It allows for overcommitment. But the overcommitment cannot go beyond 50%. What do we mean when we say overcommitment? Anyone? If you say this allows for overcommitment, what does that mean? Yes, please, Refilo.
Yes, by overcommitment, that means memory overcommitment. We say that the virtual machine is the memory that is more than available.
Okay. So in this case, what does it mean? Assuming that we have allocated 50 gig, what does overcommitment mean now? It means if we are using thin provisioning, we can allocate more than 50 gig. We can allocate more than the 50 gig that has been allocated to this disk. Okay. But if we are to allocate more than 50 gig, we cannot allocate more than 50% of the 50 gig. What is 50% of 50? 50% of 50, that's what?
25.
25, okay.
It's 25 gig.
That's 25 gig, that's true. So what it means is, if we are using thin provisioning, this disk can get more than 50 gig up to 75 gig. That would be the maximum, up to 75 gigabytes. All right. So sometimes you can get a question. You can get a question like for instance, in thin provisioning mode or in thin provisioning, a disk. I remember seeing a question that said a 128 gigabytes disk can be allocated 150 gigabytes, something like that. And the answers were true or false. What they are asking here is this concept here, that in thin provisioning, of course, we know that there is overcommitment, but the overcommitment must not be more than 50%. So what you just have to do is to calculate 150% of 128 and see whether it is less than or equal to 1/5. Then you choose your yes or your no. So in this case, is it true or false? Assuming that we have a 128 gig using thin provisioning mode, can it be allocated 150 gigabytes? Refilo?
Yes, in this case, it's true.
It's true, isn't it? Okay. Because the maximum that can be allocated here is 128 plus half of 128. And that is way beyond 150. So 150 can be allocated to a disk with 128 gigabytes capacity. Okay. Any questions on that? Right. Then there is thick provisioning zeroed out. Yes, Rachel.
You said that a virtual machine can be allocated 50% more space than is on the disk. So in the case where we have shared disks, does that mean we get 50% more, or 50% shared by all virtual machines on the disk?
Okay, these are different. They are different. When you realize if you actually use Fusion Compute, you realize that these are under different categories. A disk can be shared or non-shared, okay? A disk can be common, thick provisioning, or whatever is there. So your question was, if we are in thin provisioning and then we expand the disk capacity, will that also be shared? Was that the question? Rachel?
Yes, sir.
Okay. For now, let's just focus on the disk space. If the disk itself has been expanded, if it was shared, what it basically means is we have added more shareable capacity. Okay. We've just added capacity to the disk itself. Whether it was shared or it was not shared, that doesn't change a thing. Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Whether it was shared or not, it doesn't really change a thing. And then we have the thick provisioning. Again, this is related to the concept of thick provisioning that I explained on the previous slide, where we said we are allocating the disk the total space at the beginning. Upon creation, we allocated the total space. Then we also have dependent disks, independent disks. and independent non-persistent disks. Now, what are dependent disks? A dependent disk, this is included in a snapshot. A dependent disk is included in a snapshot. Changes to a dependent disk take effect immediately and are written permanently. Okay. They take effect immediately and are written permanently. That's why we are saying they are included in a snapshot, because we can have a backup of our VM if we use the disk, if we use the dependent disk. Then independent disk, independent persistent disk, these in these disks, changes are immediately and permanently returned to the disk, which is not affected by snapshot. So the difference now between dependent disk and independent disk, both of them, they can write changes immediately and permanently. But when it comes to snapshots, they don't affect independent persistent. They affect dependent disks. Okay. So what it means is, if you want to have snapshots on your disk, the disk type should be dependent. It should not be independent persistent. Then for independent non-persistent disks, in that mode, disks are discarded after the VM is stopped or restored using a snapshot. Disks are discarded after the VM is restored. Right. So here we discard the disk after the VM is restored. Here we write changes, or we write changes immediately and permanently, but it's not affected by snapshots. Here we write changes permanently and immediately, but it's also affected by snapshots. So as far as what I wanted us to look at today is concerned, these are the concepts that I wanted us to look at. So sometimes you may be asked the questions when, for instance, what we need to know here again, maybe before I make that comment, is if a disk is dependent, it cannot be independent persistent again. Because when we make the selections for these disk configurations, you have to choose one. Okay. It's not like we are using checkboxes. We'll be using more like radio buttons. Yeah, more like radio buttons or drop-down menus where you have to choose one. So a disk can, if it's dependent, it cannot be independent persistent at the same time. If it's independent persistent, it cannot be independent non-persistent at the same time. Okay. So again, it applies to this one. If a disk is thin provisioned, if a disk is common disk, it cannot be thin provisioned. It cannot be thick provisioned. If a disk is shared, it cannot be non-shared at the same time. Okay. So be careful of questions that would try to give you answers where they combine these different characteristics from different categories. Like for instance, you can be asked a question like, which of the following can be done on Fusion Compute? And then you are given answers like, set disk as thin provisioning, set disk as thin provisioning, and common disk, something like that. We cannot do that. We cannot have a common disk at the same time being a thin provisioned disk. You may sometimes have answers like set disk as shared disk and non-shared disk. You have to be, just have to take, just have to be careful. Look at such answers carefully and know that no, this cannot be done. Okay, so any questions? Okay, if there are no questions, we'll end here for today. What I'll do is, was yesterday, some people who were there, I think some of them are still here today, they requested that instead of having to do revision together, or maybe having to go through revision questions together, they would rather look at the questions on their own and be able to gauge their performance. So based on that request, maybe what I'll just do is I'll drop some questions on that Google Drive folder, and you can take a look at them yourselves. Of course, I removed the answers because I want you to think first. Otherwise, if I just give you the answers, you will not be able to think. And then you also have to go through the mock exams that are on the Huawei platform, like I mentioned yesterday. But if you feel like later you might need us to go through the questions together, as long as it's not after next week, Friday, you can tell me. Meanwhile, we are waiting for Becky to get us an account that we can use for live labs on the cloud. But like I said, while we are waiting for that, please go and watch the videos on Fusion Compute Labs. The videos are there on the Huawei iLearning platform. If you register on the iLearning platform, you will see that everything that we have done are included there as topics. So you can watch the videos. You can start by just attempting the quizzes and then see how well you are doing. If you see that there's something that you didn't get well, you can watch the videos, you can read from the learning guide and then attempt the quiz again. Take note that there are just 3 attempts in each of those quizzes. Okay. And then when you are done, if you still feel like some of these concepts are still difficult for you to understand, we can have another session and revise together as a group. All right, so we are done for today. Any questions?
Hello.
Yes.
Okay, I don't have a question as such, but I can take a recommendation.
Please go ahead.
Yesterday, I attended the final exam on the platform.
Yes.
What I've realized is there is a need that we should know more about the fusion compute. So it's very important that we know that,
Yeah,
almost everything about it.
That's true. Like I said, you see, there are different cloud computing providers. There is Huawei. There is there are actually lots of them. Microsoft also has the cloud service. Many of them. So if you are said to be Huawei certified, the implication is, in addition to knowing the theory, which is common to all other Huawei, which is common to all other cloud computing services, you also need to know the cloud computing product offered by Huawei. That's why they will ask questions on Fusion Compute. So you cannot be certified in Huawei without knowing Fusion Compute. So you are very right when you say that they ask lots of questions on Fusion Compute. Some of them you can answer them even without, you can answer some of the questions without doing the practicals, but others you need to have done the practicals, or at least to have watched the videos of those practicals. So that's very true. Your comment, I agree with you. I agree with you. For those ones with laptops that have at least 8 gig, you can install Fusion Compute on your laptops. The guide is there. How to install it, it's there as a PDF file. You can go through those steps, and from there you can do whatever you want, experiment, try lots of things and see what happens. Okay, are there any other comments before we close?